I'm Jean-Sébastien Mariez, Paris-based qualified attorney at law. I'm the founding partner of a law firm called Momentum Avocat. I spend a lot of time advising on platform regulation and product compliance once the regulation have passed. So I'm very honored and very curious to moderate this great panel that we have today to discuss the DSA and how to basically anticipate the compliance with this new piece of regulation. Just before to introduce things, I'll say a word about the panelists we have today. So we have Mr. Benoît Loutrel from the ARCOM, which is the potential French regulator in charge of the DSA, implementation of DSA on the French territory at least. We have Michel Steltman coming from Netherlands, managing director of the Digital Infrastructure Association, which is a trade association. And Kieran Madison from Check Steps, Trust and Safety Product Manager. So today we'll try to give you some sense of not so much what is the DSA, because it will require a lot of time, but how to address the compliance, what's the timeline, and on an operational standpoint, how to start with the compliance process when you're a service provider, a platform in the scope of this piece of legislation. As you know, the DSA aims at tackling harmful content and illicit content online. It is basically upholding the key principle of the e-commerce directive, but the main piece of the DSA deals with the specific rules, listing due diligence obligation tailored to certain specific intermediary services, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about this. Compliance process has already started last February. On February 17th, the services were due to disclose the numbers of active users they have within the European territory. But now the DSA has still to be completed by few guidelines, few implementation acts, few delegated acts also, which will shed more clarity on what is expected from the platforms, the services, but also from the other stakeholders that are involved in tackling this kind of content. So today we'll have Mr. Loutrel beginning with some explanation about what's the views of future regulator of this new regulation, talking about the compliance timeline and the roles of the national regulators and the Commission, for example. Michel Steltman will tell us about maybe the best practice that may be already there on the market and within the different services that may help to comply with the DSA, and Kieran Madison. So we'll come to a very operational, service-oriented discussion, and we'll see, for example, whether some other compliance process, like the GDPR compliance process, and the experience that we may have with this kind of compliance may be helpful to address DSA compliance. So I will handle the mic to Mr. Loutrel to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I am Benoît Loutrel, a board member of ARCOM. ARCOM is a French digital, audiovisual and digital media regulator. So we come from audiovisual media regulation, but for the last 5 years we have been engaged already in implementing the first digital media regulation, with the first wave of French laws trying to tackle the issue we were facing, like in many countries. We had a law to fight manipulation of information. We had a law to fight hate speech. It was 98% voided by our constitutional court, but we learned a lot in this process. And then we had also another law, second law to fight disinformation, in fact, which was derived from the draft DSA. Today I'm not going to discuss about what we are doing in France, because really those laws were an attempt to try to go through a learning curve on how to design those regulations. And if I go back to what the representative of OECD said in the previous conference, he concluded by saying he was worried that we were going to break up the internet on a worldwide basis, with a wave of regulation coming in on a national basis and creating obstacles to the development of the digital economy. Well, the good luck is that we are in the EU, and in the EU we have managed to succeed in passing the DSA, the Digital Services Act, so that we will have one regulation for the whole EU, so 27 countries, plus a member of the EEA, plus countries which are in the access process to be future member of the EU. So we will have we won't break the internet in pieces. More importantly, I guess the EU has been very careful in designing a framework which is open-ended, which has been designed to be scalable outside of the EU, in the sense it does not create very detailed specific rules, but rather work on the basis of compliance, trying to increase the accountability of companies, but without telling them what to do, not to put undue restraint. So I think we can reassure OECD that at least in the EU we have very positive dynamics. I guess in the DSA you can look at it several ways. It's a very large text, more than 100 articles. Part of it really deals with the big players. In the DSA, they are called VLOPs, very large online platform. There are the Google, the Meta, the TikTok, all the big names. Today I won't focus the discussion on those VLOPs, because if you are here, if you are VLOPs, and if you are not really well advanced in preparing the DSA, you are not in the right place. Typically, the DSA for the VLOPs has already started. They had to declare themselves on last February. They will be designated, most likely in May by the Commission officially, and then they will have to be compliant in early September. So that's a very specific cases for the biggest companies, which are already engaged in direct discussion with the EU Commission, which is specifically in charge of this part of the DSA. But still, the DSA applied to a much wider group of companies, all the companies that were working under the e-commerce directive, and for them, there is a change. The good thing is that a positive change, that the e-commerce directive in the EU, like Section 230 in the US, is really the first level which creates the capacity to operate with this limited liability scheme, which protects the company from full responsibility on the content that they host on their website, on their platforms. This is strengthened in the EU, which is a good news, so we are going in the right direction. We used to have this limited liability scheme as a directive, meaning that it was translated in national laws, so it was nearly the same thing everywhere, but different in each of our countries. With the DSA, this thing is pushed back directly at the EU level. So you will have one legal framework for the limited liability of intermediaries directly set up at the EU level, which will really facilitate the capacity of all companies to operate across Europe. That's the positive part. But of course, the DSA was also trying to address a request which was expressed in most countries around the world and everywhere in Europe, to see that companies operating under the e-commerce directive show greater respect, greater commitment to defend the fundamental rights and be more responsive. You have the limited liability, but we also want to be in the capacity to fight terrorism content, to fight hate speech, to fight disinformation, to fight the fact that what was perceived in some cases as a lack of responsibility of the people operating under this limited liability. But so the idea is really that a series of obligation of means have been added to make sure that anybody operating under this scheme, which will basically was normally yesterday already having a trust and safety function. Yesterday the trust and safety function was a nice thing to have under ESR responsibility. Tomorrow it's a requirement under the DSA. So it's a framework to assess, to professionalize what the performance of your companies in providing trust and safety services, and to report to a single regulator. And the positive thing also is that we are keeping the idea in Europe of having single shop. So each company will also only have one regulator. Regulator will be based in the EU country where the company is based. We still follow the principle of origin, but we'll have a very strong network of regulators to ensure that all the regulators operate on the same standard and apply the same level of requirement. There is a new governance in the DSA, which is going even one step higher compared to what you have in the GDPR, which was already very strong. But here we're going one step higher to really ensure that the company can have a one-stop shop, exchange with the national regulator where they are based, and then operate freely across Europe. We have the same thing for the end user. The regulators will also be the single-stop shopping for the end user, so the civil society in the country of destination. So typically, if you take the ARCOM, we will be the regulator for companies platform based in France, and they will have to be accountable to ARCOM, and they will fulfill through this reporting requirement, the requirement for the whole of the EU. And we will be also a single shop for citizens in France to help them address directly all the other regulators and to have a capacity to exercise their rights with platforms which are based anywhere in Europe. So we hope that we really have the right dynamics, and that we are lucky, really, I think, in Europe, because we have found this balance of trying both to increase the accountability of the companies operating under the e-commerce, which was really a request on a political level, while protecting the ability to innovate, to be agile, and to continue to have a very swifting digital economy. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer your question.
Thanks. Actually, I have a quick question. I know the strong harmonization aspect, which results from the fact that we're talking about regulation. Also the one-stop shop, which was there but is still there. And also the fact that now it's a must-have to have a trust and safety team because of the due diligence obligation, which are a core aspect of the DSA. Just a quick question before handing over to Michel. As far as the non-very large online platform and very large search engines, so for the others, very in practical terms, can you say a quick word about, in your perspective, the timeline in the coming year and your expectations as in your perspective of future regulators?
I guess the timeline, the next step really are, regulation was adopted last year. The first requirement became effective for the very large online platform in February. So we'll have a big step to have a full compliance required in probably in the fall. But then it's February 2024 for everybody, where the whole regime will be applicable to everybody. Honestly, in between, we need to have also all the member states designating who will be the digital service coordinators on other authorities in charge of implementing the DSA, because in most countries, in some countries you will have one regulator, in some countries you will have several regulators involved. One will be the lead regulator, the digital service coordinator, and you need laws to designate those regulators because they have to be independent. I'm not certain that all the regulators will be in place by the end of the year. So, but more importantly, in the philosophy which prevailed to design the DSA, there is the idea that you have to be proportionate and you have to be progressive. Proportionate, and typically there was a major change compared to how the GDPR was designed, where we don't have a one-size-fits-all rule. So clearly you have the rule, the requirements are very limited for transport services, cash services, slightly higher for intermediary, so stronger for platforms, and even on platforms you have different level of requirement. And you have this incredible layer which is very stringent for very large online platform. And the idea clearly, which was the intent of the Parliament of the Council of Member States, was to require the regulator to start from the top and go to going down. So really it will start with the big players. They will be the one who are going to test how the DSA is working. And as we work, as we go through our learning curve with them, we will see delegated act explaining in more details, guideline being published, and slowly it will apply to everybody. I guess the best advice is really at this point is just realize that trust and safety is, you will be accountable on your trust and safety function from now on. So you can start the work with your advisor. You manage everything internally. Is there some parts that you outsource? How do you, and then you will see the information coming in. And we'll have the same philosophy as GDPR. When GDPR was implemented, for the first initial years, we will not, we'll ask people, give room for people to adapt, and let a lot of time for people to come up to the standard. We will not start with putting fines.
Well, that's great news, actually. Michael, well, thanks for being there. I think you wanted to talk about, well, actually the different categories and intermediaries that will be impacted, and also the best practices that they already implement that may be helpful to comply with the DSA.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Sebastian. Let me first spend a minute to explain what I'm doing here. What is this guy from Holland doing in this panel here in France? Well, as you may know, the Netherlands is an internet and data hub of a significant proportion. We host the second largest internet exchange in the world. That's been going on for about 25 years. And the Netherlands has several hundreds of very large carrier-neutral data centers, and also presence of the VLOPs that have presence in Microsoft and Google. And they found the Netherlands because the Netherlands is connected to pretty much every other network in the world. So with milliseconds latency, you can reach the rest of the world. And why is that significant? Well, that makes Holland a very attractive place for content, video content, pictures. And that is why we have been the #2 in the world for hosting CSAM, child sexual abuse material. Not something we're proud of, but that happened. And also, but we also host game. Ubisoft, all Ubisoft games are hosted in the Netherlands. So that gives us a specific responsibility. And also, it's a very, let's say, wide and diverse ecosystem of medium-sized, small-sized companies. About 60,000 companies in the Netherlands make their money with online activities, including providing access, hosting, providing access to data. So that makes us a significant country and player in the DSA. Now I come to the second part of the DSA. Well, the advantage of a small country is that we're reasonably strong in private-public partnerships. Everybody knows each other. We know MPs, we know the involved ministries and the authorities and the regulators. So that makes us more inclined to discuss options and opportunities rather than approach each other and discuss this topic at both ends of the table. Government versus companies. We're more into that goes for the VLOPs, but not for pretty much the rest of the companies in the Netherlands. Now I come to that part I agree with DSA. Finally, we have more generic principles and frameworks that go for entire Europe. That gives us more, let's say, more body into what should we do. But it doesn't touch, and I come to the topic of how we're approaching this now in the Netherlands, how we're moving forward. It doesn't touch the really nitty and hairy problem of the DSA, that it's basically saying we're privatizing, determining the freedom of speech and everything else to companies. it's companies who have to decide whether what you say is legitimate, is legal, is appropriate, is proportionate. It's companies. In the real world, we have the freedom of speech in court. It's the legal system that takes care of that. But now, actually, the DSA is sort of saying and forcing companies to determine what is legal and what can be done on the internet. And that's something we're principally basically opposed to. But the alternative is even, is just as not attractive. Because if we say the government is determining what you can say and what you can do on the internet, and they determine what should be removed, then immediately you feel we're touching the freedom of speech. So that's why we very early on, already several years ago, decided for the implementation of the DSA, so the practical process, what goes on in practice, we need a more hybrid model. So we embrace the notion of trusted flaggers. Trusted flaggers is a very important and a key concept where we have sort of independent vetting, independent triage, and independent determination and decisions about what should be removed or not. It's not a power we should put in the hands of just companies, and let alone that you want companies, employees at a company, at an SME company, look at pictures that you and your wife uploaded to determine if that's appropriate or not. It's not something we want. We want a more independent function. The trusted flagger is a key concept. So just a few words about how we approach this. We tested this hybrid approach with a dossier that's been open for more than a decade, child sexual abuse material, which is obviously something that must be removed from the internet, but still in many countries it was there. So we developed an approach with 5 cornerstones, measuring where is it, and to our surprise we found it's not every company that's affected, it's just a handful, it's a few that make a business model out of this type of illegitimate content, which is the same for hate speech, for terroristic content. We increased the code of conduct notice and takedown, which is also part of the DSA, the fact that you react to notices and have a due process. We also, and this is very important, we came early on with technical measures to support the exchange of information, to measure how fast companies respond, how effective the process works, how their checks and balances works, and how you can also implement technologies such as hash checks and others to do that. A very not generic, but let's say pointed at specific companies that have to deal with these problems. And then we decided, are we complete? No, only then we decided we need an authority and we need the possibility to have fines and to have sanctions and also procedures against companies who don't comply. So the interesting part is that we use the legal stuff as the last cornerstone and not as the first. So we operated in a legal environment that was already there, the e-commerce directive, made these instruments, and then we found the legal basis for an authority. And in the Netherlands, there is a new authority for child sexual abuse material, and the authority for terrorist content online, because we found that the processes for notice and takedown and everything works pretty much the same across these types of content. And we believe that other forms of content that fall under the DSA will match that process. Last, we started 2 new initiatives in the Netherlands, very large public-private partnerships, one called ProCam, Proactive Content Management, endorsed by a minister, with all the major players, the authorities, sector organizations, also the VLOPs are there. They're reluctant, but they're there, to talk about ProCom, how we can put, let's say, this implementation method for the DSA on steroids. Because that's what we believe is a structure and a way of operating that fills the gap between the legal principles and between the nitty-gritty details of how the sector works. One last word. It's also important to determine what we distinguish between 3 layers that sort of are in the DSA. It's sort of a reverse pyramid. Below, in the point of the pyramid, you find the pure network services called mere conduit in earlier. Let's say the parties that just transport bits and have no clue about what these bits are and shouldn't know what these bits are because they're protected by net neutrality. So, and then there's the layer of companies that provide basic infrastructure and basic platforms, you know, like hosting and domains and everything, that have some notion about who their customers are, but not about what their customers, their users of the customers do. And then, let's say, at the white base of the pyramid, reversed, is the platforms that do have a direct interaction with their users, you know, that do know the users that post content, that place it. And you can very easily see that there are 3 different approaches. There must be a differentiated approach for each of these 3 layers, and that's also we're taking into account.
Thanks a lot, Michiel. It's certainly not an easy task indeed to handle freedom of expression limitation on a day-to-day basis. And I think I'll ask the 3 of you after we hear Kieran to react on this. And it's interesting already to see how in Netherlands the co-regulation and best practice you have in order to address this. Kieran, now as a let's say as a service provider, would be interesting to hear you about maybe the lessons you learned from GDPR or others' experience, and I'd be curious to know if you would already have some feedback from clients that are engaging in this DSA compliance process.
So hi, I'm Kieran. I'm a product manager at Checkstep. I'm focused on building tooling and features for upcoming regulations. I was actually at OneTrust working in privacy in 2018, just before the GDPR wave crushed everyone under a rock. So I have privacy on one side of my brain and I have DSA on the other side of my brain, and yes, I'm a super fun person.
You have a big brain.
I'm also a really fun person to talk to at parties. Privacy one side and DSA the other. This feels like GDPR did. It's that same level of regulation. It's going to have that same level of impact once people understand what it means for them. I remember with privacy, there were all sorts of rumors flying around. You've got to delete all of your contact database because you don't have consent to contact any of them. We're in that little bubble at the moment. So it kind of makes sense to look at DSA like we look at GDPR. That it's not a privacy legislation, it's actually a rights legislation, and DSA feels like a rights legislation as well. So that might seem like a funny thing to say, but let's kind of run through a little bit of an example. If you are a platform provider and you are moderating content, one of the things that you have to do is to provide a statement of reason when you take action on somebody's content. So that means you need to tell them you've taken action, and yes, that includes soft actions like downranking and hiding from search. You have to tell them whether it was automatically detected or detected by a human. You have to tell them what policy they violated or whether it was illegal content. You have to give them a right to appeal internally or go to an out-of-court dispute mechanism. So the first thing you've got to be able to do is to have those published policies that tell people, and they may have to be different for children. If you've got users under the age of 18, they may have to be written differently. You may have to have different policies, but you have to have those policies there and policies published. And then you have to have a place to moderate content. And because this word fair and consistent keeps cropping up within the DSA, everything's got to be fair, everything's got to be consistent. You've got to have your policies side by side with the content you're looking at. You've got to make a judgment on that content in regards to the policy. So then once you've decided it's violating, you have to issue that statement of reason. You have to have that appeal workflow internally to be able to handle that appeal and give a user a final decision. This breeds its own problem in that if you tell people this piece of content violated this particular policy and we detected it using this, you've instantly told your bad actors how you found them within reason. So your trust and safety operation is going to become a lot more dynamic than you're probably used to. So it's no longer set up, leave, let it run. It's going to be more dynamic. There's going to be more input from you. What's happening? What's going on? So all that information also gets punched into transparency reporting, which we heard about in the previous panel, and I'm interested to see how the two transparency reportings link together. But you're going to have to tell the public, this was the amount of stuff that was on our platform, this was the policy it violated, this was the amount of people that appealed, this is what they upheld, this was the restores, This were the people that went out to out-of-court dispute mechanism. That is just a really basic example with a basic moderation exercise that anyone in this room moderates content does on a day-to-day basis. But it's that level of information, the level of granularity, the level of detail is just going up and up and up, and the impact that that's going to have on your overall operation. And then we get to the stuff that we don't know yet. So we don't know how Trusted Flaggers is going to work. We don't know whether we integrate with a database. We don't know whether there's a list published online. We don't know how we report illegal content yet. It's just not been published. Does it go to Europol? Does it go to NECMEC as we do now with child safety stuff? Nobody knows. So then we talk about harmonization. And I love that the harmonization is actually in the wording for the DSA because it has a big impact on privacy. People, when they appeal, have up to 6 months to lodge an appeal. So your data retention limits are going to have to go up. So you're going to have to go out, you're going to have to speak to your wider legal teams, explain why. Your DPIAs are going to have to be redone. Your records of processing are going to have to be redone. So it's not just impacting trust and safety. It's now impacting tech, who have to up these limits, who have to produce statement of reasons, who have to pull data, compile transparency reporting, make sure there's a side-by-side comparison of content and policy. You've then got to go to your legal teams and get all your limits moved up, get all your DPIAs rewritten, make sure the legal basis is all sound and solid. And when I explain this to people who aren't VLOPs, because we're not talking about them, they're all okay, is that people say, oh yeah, well, look at GDPR enforcement and nothing really happened. They think they're going to be safe because they're smaller platforms. Let me just remind you that I think it was the French regulator were the first people to issue a GDPR sanction against a small French marketing company. This is the way that they set precedent. They don't go after the big boys first because they'll tie them up in 3 to 5 years worth of litigation and nothing will move. So actually you're more unsafe as a smaller platform. Sorry to leave you with that thought over the weekend. So in practical reality, the first thing that I recommend everyone does first is actually conduct a risk assessment. It was the first thing that anyone did with GDPR, and it makes sense. You need to know where your risks are, what are your underlying risks, and what action do you need to take on those risks. And in regards to timeline, we are 10 months away from full enforcement. We're all going to take 2 months off for the summer because it's the summer. We're all going to take a month off over Christmas and December because that's what we do. And then you've got to be working this as of the 17th of February next year. Well, that's 4 months. Are you going to build this? Are you going to buy it? Are you going to outsource it? There's no benchmarking to measure. Is this statement of reason correct? Is this appeal workflow correct? Am I integrated with the right databases for trusted flaggers, for notice and action, for law enforcement reporting? There's 6 months. So I don't know why you're sitting here listening to me, because you've got work to do.
Thanks, Kieran. That's very helpful advice to make sure everyone can start thinking about the best way to start the compliance process. I'm conscious of time and we have 10 minutes left. So guys, if you can just quickly say a word about what you think about who can help the platforms. There are code of conducts coming. There are the role of the trusted flaggers that you mentioned. There's also the dispute settlement bodies that should be appointed. I'll be interested to hear the three of you about this, and so that we can have a few questions from you afterwards. Thank you. Who want to start?
Yeah. Well, we have to get practical. This is perfectly illustrated by Kieran, and also we have to get practical very quick. What we also learned from GDPR, it was just a bunch of legal text, with all due respect, that was thrown over the wall, and then you figure it out. You know, you need to make processing contracts, and there were no templates. There were no, despite the fact that the GDPR had those provisions, Article 42 in it, there are no quality marks. There are no. There's really nothing. So it was a legal circus. And all we do now is clicking away cookies and pop-up messages that's telling what the company does about privacy, with all due respect. I do more, I know. But we have to learn from that this is equally complex. I totally agree with Kieran. And that we have to get practical very quickly. We have to think about how does this work in practice? Who is going to be a trusted flagger? Who can we trust? What are the provisions for a trusted flagger? And we have to put those mechanisms, the information sharing, in place to prevent a situation where especially the smaller companies are buried under a burden of legal stuff, of compliancy that they can't take. Because remember, we have other dossier, sovereignty, that we're going to discuss tomorrow in another room, where we really believe that it's important for Europe to have strong independent players, you know, to have a strong European market. And that market is SME. And if we bury SMEs under and equally, and then the CRA comes up, and then the Data Act comes up, and then the Data Governance Act is around the corner. So if we're going to bury companies with legal stuff for which we have no practical solutions in place, it's going to be pretty nasty, and only the few larger players will survive. So let's get practical. Yeah, yeah. That's my call to action.
Can I send some positive vibes, because you are really negative?
I'm concerned. Call to action.
No, I think there's limit. First, GDPR was, you were too harsh. It has created a lot of value. But the GDPR has a very broad scope. Nearly everybody was subject to GDPR. We are subject to GDPR with you have an address book. You should comply with GDPR. Everybody is not going to comply with the DSA. You have to be subject to the e-commerce limited liability. Everybody do not claim the limited liability. If you claim the limited liability, yes, DSA will apply. Banks usually don't claim, as far as I know, in their activity limited liability. Typically, we don't expect to have anybody in the banking sector subject to the DSA, or on a very specific, maybe, function. But so the scope is much more narrow, first. Second, you already had the requirement to treat notification you were receiving. This has been applied since it's in e-commerce. The only thing which, so you already were dealing, say, okay, do I handle that internally, dealing whether it's legal, not illegal. It's nothing new. You already had made choices, whether you, when do you outsource to your legal counsel. Here, what you have in the DSA, yes, you will have more stringent requirements, you will have to report, but you will also have very strong involvement of regulators, of the EU Commission, of this network of regulators, to allow, to formulate policy guidelines that will help everybody to industrialize this system. That's why the trust and safety is becoming a new industry, and I'm sure that we will see in some cases you will some companies will acquire advisory services, but at some point we will see trust and safety as a service. So typically to allow a more stringent compliance, a greater accountability, which is a political request from everybody in Europe and in the rest of the world, but at the same time also a real commitment of public authorities to keep the cost under control, allowing this industry to get really industrialized. So I think
question of cost positive. Is very important. Thanks, thanks Benoit. Kieran, a quick word so that we can take questions, please.
Sure. I'm going to dispute what Benoit said and say that GDPR was awful. As somebody who was working at OneTrust at the time, the amount of blue chip clients that were coming to us in June and saying, so this GDPR thing, we really think we need a tool to handle this. It doesn't even bear thinking about. Just say there is a lot of work to do. Half of our leadership, pretty much half of our leadership team came from Trust and Safety at Meta. There's a lot of stuff that's in the DSA that are how these big platforms operate. So what we try to do is to make the same sort of tooling accessible to the mid-market, and we threw a team of 20 people at this for 7 months, and we're almost there. And this was people that had the experience, that knew what we were doing, knew the DSA, and had a team of tech people that could build it. So it's not an easy task. It is a bigger shift from e-commerce to DSA than it was from the individual privacy legislations that we had to GDPR, in my opinion. And I'll have a drink with you later and we can discuss it in more detail.
Okay, thanks. It seems like we have a question there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian Corby. Ian Corby. I've been working on EU Consent, which is an interoperable age assurance solution for Europe funded by the Commission. Have any of you figured out what the DSA means in terms of how we should treat children? because it says that some, on the one hand, it's services which are accessible by children, and on the other one, it's services that are actually used by children, which is two different things. And then in some cases, it says we ought to not advertise using profiling to children. And then on the other hand, it says we shouldn't gather data to find out how old the users are. So I'm really confused. Can you help?
Who wants to try answering this?
I can give you a short answer. No. No, we don't know how that's going to work. And it's a really interesting thing. So I've worked with different legal teams around identification of children. It means processing minors' data. It's high risk. It also means if you identify the children, then you have a legal obligation to protect them. So a lot of people just shut their eyes and say, we're not gonna do that unless there is actually a problem, and we identify during the course of that problem that they're a minor. I have lawyers here who probably have a more clever answer. Whether it's more helpful, we'll see.
I'll give it a try also. Many people are trying to read the DSA as you were reading e-commerce. But in e-commerce, you don't have a regulator. E-commerce was drafted to be applicable directly, so any company was expected to read e-commerce, say, okay, I understand how to apply it, and then the judge will tell me whether I was right or not. Here we are trying to build something, systemic regulation, try to get this at the same time, greater accountability, still control the cost, and that's why regulators were introduced. So at this point, yes, you have several parts of the DSA. You cannot understand exactly how it works because the regulators are not there. It was also clearly designed with this purpose of having a regulation that would not be obsolete next year. The digital world changed continuously. So there was this idea to keep a lot of flexibility in the text, to create a toolbox for this network of regulators, a very strong governance to be sure they won't abuse it, of course, and then to let them adapt it and explain it. So to some extent, issues are the question you are asking, but you have plenty of examples like that. Yes, you will have to wait to see the implementation order coming from the Commission, the guidelines explaining how it will work. Choices will have to be made, and then they will be reviewed and adapted over time. We are building a framework for the future, and to regulate an industry which is agile, and we want to keep its agility. So that's why you don't have all the answers to the question just by reading the text.
Thank you. Other question, or Michel?
If not, then I can add to that, and also, very quickly then. Yes, some hope. In the 3 tiers that I outlined, the lower tier will not be affected by the DSA. They will do what they did. The middle tier is our proposition. What we found in our Netherlands approach is to only identify the hotspots, those few hosting companies that make a business model out of attracting stuff that we don't want. So that's very limited. The rest will not be bothered and will sort of fall in the lower category. But the platform layer, that's where we need the tools and the templates. That's where we need the practical work. So if we come up with some solution for children, my vote would be, okay, let's publish and let's make a best practice. And let's have regulators and authorities that take these best practices and throw them at you this is the best practice approach that you can apply, so that we don't end up in a situation where every company has to reinvent the wheel each and every time.
Thanks. Let's have a last question, maybe. Okay. I saw some fingers over there. Yeah. Sorry.
So
can you just pass the mic? Thank you.
I'll try and speak like this. 2 questions. One stemming from your comment. Did it make sense to start with one country and then expand to everyone else? Because then you would have a framework, best practices, learnings, etc., rather than now everyone doing it and trying to fall either safe or fail or what have you. Think of the organizations, or the companies, the tech companies that are going to work on it. It's going to be difficult for them. That's one. Second is, get a great example from the Netherlands on trusted practice. I think that's the best way of going ahead. But then how are you guys looking at educating the trusted flaggers to align with the tech companies so that they produce good insights? Data, if you search on the internet, basic, not sharing anything confidential, trusted flaggers often flag in a different category as it is action. So they would flag for, say, sexual content, gets action, is harassment, or what have you. So how are you guys taking care of this piece, that they get good understanding and they are accurate in terms of their flagging? Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to say a word about trusted flagger certification?
The first
maybe?
question, I guess, that's what we have done. We started. Germany started with a NetzDG law. France started with a couple of laws. First thing we have learned, it's not sustainable. We don't want to break the EU internal digital market in pieces. So that's what now that's the first lesson we learned, and that's why very quickly France switched its energy, saying we want an EU framework, and we are going to do that at the EU level. Because if you start doing it on a country basis, first it's not it creates a democratic issue in Europe. So now it's we work on an EU basis. On the trusted flaggers, it's really interesting because you have different experience. In some cases, trusted flaggers were invented by the VLOPs, the biggest platform, and they're all different, and they were defined. A trusted flagger according to Google is different from a trusted flagger according to Facebook. In some cases, you are dynamic on a national basis. That was described in the Netherlands. With the DSA, we have the ability to unify that and to make it, to simplify it, to normalize it, to again contain the cost, make it efficient for everybody. And let's be true, the DSA create a framework to regulate the platforms and the trusted flaggers. The trusted flaggers will be accountable also. They will have to publish a transparency report, and the regulator will have to designate the trusted flaggers and can also decide that they are no longer trusted flaggers if their performance is not good enough. So we have tools on both sides to make the system work. And it's really a very interesting tool, honestly. Which can be applied, and by the way, outside of Europe. That's typically the knowledge that will be developed in Europe can benefit other regions in the world. That's why I think the model was designed in a way that can be you can scale it on a bigger scale than the European scale.
Thank you.
Yeah, to add to that, in Europe we're not very good yet in learning from each other as countries. So I would, of course, events like these help. Where we start visiting each other and listening to each other's backgrounds and best practices. But I would probably vote for a more ENISA style approach. ENISA is a security agency that's done some great work. Radio Equipment Directive is doing standards and certifications that everybody shares. That has the expertise. So it wouldn't be a bad idea, I think, to have European agencies to help everybody with best practices and to bring all these best practices together, taking into account the cultural differences and smaller legal differences between countries. But yes, I would definitely vote for that approach where we do more in practice, although that would also mean a bigger Brussels bureaucracy, which is its own, but that's a different discussion after drinks. But anyways, I think that's important, that learning also is turned to practice by the EU Commission, and that these best practices will help, because, like I said, more laws are going to follow, and more of these debates are going to happen in the next few years over other topics.
Thanks.
But you don't have one regulator. You don't have the EU Commission in the center regulating alone, or ARCOM alone in France. It's really a network of regulators that is being set up with a governance, which is completely different from the governance of the Digital Market Act, where you have the Commission in the center, which is rather alone with advisory body, but in the DSA there is this recognition that you have to get a network effect and take into account the experience of all the countries. And by the way, something extremely positive, one of the regulators has already been designated by law, we know it, it's the Irish regulator, which is not neutral. It's a very good news, because clearly the country of origin is still present, and we still have a lot of platforms based in Ireland. So there is a very positive signal sent by Ireland. I'm flying to Ireland next month to meet the new regulator and start the discussion.
Thank you. So we'll finish with this positive stance. Thanks for your attention. Hope we started to answer a few questions. I'm sure panelists will be available for a chat outside. Thank you. Bye. Thank you all.